When I first arrived at Magnum, my background was a business background, and I came to Magnum and I looked at the overall landscape of the editorial market, and I saw many things sort of converging at the same time. Number one, I saw the newspapers and magazines having a hard time to generate assignments, because I saw that the advertising money was leaving the newspapers and magazines. This is 2003, 2004. Leaving the magazines and going online. And once that happened and went online, it would fractionalize the advertising spend, and therefore they wouldn't have the same amount of money to send photographers on assignment. If photographers not on assignment, then they're not producing content. If they're not producing content, then all of a sudden you don't have an inventory of images to sell for licensing purposes. So it's a sort of a perfect storm of everything that's happening. And I said, you know, we as Magnum need to look for new revenue streams and look for a new way of distributing the stories. And now with the internet, this is back in 2003, you can be a self-publisher and you can go directly there. So this was in the back of my mind, looking for new revenue, looking for a new way to distribute. The second thing I saw was I had a photographer come in, and he started talking to me, and I said, you know, tell me about this image and tell me about this story. And he started going into this whole story. Well, I was on a canoe for 4 days on the Amazon, and I was canoeing down the Amazon, and then I got out of the canoe and my legs were weak, and I walked up this hill, but then I tripped and I rolled down this hill, and then I looked up, and there, you see this? That's that picture. I saw this picture. And I was like, wow, you know, this is an amazing story. This is just a small example of one image, but it was an amazing story of the content around the content, you know. And so I said, you know, maybe we can take that and package that ourselves and go directly to an audience. So Magnum In Motion was originally formed by this idea that we could be the publishers and we could go directly to an audience. And the business plan around it was to try to take this content and syndicate it with some mainstream media outlets, and also distribute it ourselves on our own site. And that was what we started in 2004. I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned when you go to we can be a publisher. You know, I think that the idea of anyone can be a publisher because there's the web, yes, it makes the barriers to entry much easier. And so you can take content, put it together, and now there's so many tools out there that used to cost millions of dollars to create something, costs one computer for $3,000, and you can do all of this. And you can create a blog, but that's much different than actually being a publisher and building an audience. And when you're a real publisher, you have to think of three things. You have to think of the content. Well, on the one hand, Magnum has that content. We have content producers, and we've been supplying content to the magazines, but the magazines were also helping dictate what content was necessary because of the two other things. They had advertisers and they had an audience, and they knew what that audience was, and they could feed advertising to that audience, and then that's what sort of helped predict the content. So when you say we're going to be a publisher and we're going to go directly to an audience, there's some other factors that have to be considered before you really can just sort of say, okay, this is a new thing, we can go directly to the audience. And that's why the strategy with Magnum In Motion from the very beginning was to partner with existing distribution platforms as well as creating our own site, basically, because we knew we needed to get traffic off of some of those other sites. So, for example, Slate, you know, they had an audience of 10 million unique visitors a month. And when we first launched with Slate, 80% of the traffic we were getting on our site was coming from Slate. The problem that we had at the moment was that we had a site that wasn't built for a consumer audience. And this is a big shift when an organization was always a B2B and providing content to an industry that is now imploding slightly. It's a different mindset than creating an audience and maintaining an audience and sort of being a B2C player. So that is sort of the shift that we have been doing over the last few years, and we're continuing to do that shift. Every media company is in the same position. So I think that with Magnum In Motion we were ahead of the curve slightly in 2004 when we launched this, but I knew it was going to be ahead of the curve for about 30 seconds before Disney and ABC and NBC and all these companies that had tremendous libraries of content were eventually going to put them online. And they've done that, and now that they've done that, and the amount of content that's being generated not only by traditional producers, but now by independent YouTube. I mean, how many videos are coming up? Even photography, Flickr has 4 million images a day that are coming onto Flickr, and so when I look at Magnum's archive that has 450,000 images over 63 years that are high-end quality, edited, blah, 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 but when you think of Flickr and you see that 4 million images we're putting on a day, it's like, how do you compete in this? And I think that the truth is that nobody has the answer, but that everyone is trying different things. And I think that you have to continue to try in small areas, but several at a time. And then because the internet gives you such amazing data back, then you have to adjust your business plan based off of the data that is coming back quickly. And the companies that can adapt and move quickly on this data, I think, are the ones that are going to do well. I also think that you have to be very open-minded. And what I found, in the photo industry itself was, a little bit of a protecting kind of what they had. And I think that's a dangerous position to be in, because if you look at the companies that tried to protect what they had, they've all been beaten by other companies that didn't even exist. For example, the newspaper business, they lost billions of dollars through Craigslist. I met Craig, Craig's a nice guy, but, he didn't mean to destroy the newspapers, one of the primary sources of the revenue, but he created something that the newspapers should have had, but they didn't recognize, and they couldn't move fast enough to do that, and now Craigslist is established. Well, look at the music business. Who owns the music business now? Apple. Apple owns it because of iTunes. They created a distribution platform that the record labels should have done, and they were trying, but the problem with the record labels were they were trying to do it in their own, Sony wanted their own iStore, and they couldn't come together, and they didn't realize that the end consumer, they didn't want to go to 4 different places to buy music. They wanted to go to one place, and Apple recognizes that, and they created something, and they own it. And I think in photography, it's the same situation, that we have to identify, there's a tremendous audience, and there's tons of content that's being produced, and we have to adapt the way we were thinking, the traditional way we're thinking, and adapt some of these new ways to I believe, become an arbiter to a very big audience, and that's where there's a huge opportunity.